She stood in the throne room while the woman who stole her husband called her baron, while the court laughed, while the man she had loved for a decade kept his eyes on the floor. Here's what no one in that palace knew. Serafina Vale had not failed to give the king his heirs. She had hidden them, in the dark, in exile, bleeding and hunted and alone, because someone inside those golden walls had already tried to kill her once, and the sons she carried were worth more than any throne. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. And if this story hits somewhere real, you already know what to do. Tishkon. The morning they humiliated her, the sky above the Moon Realm capital was the color of old iron. Serafina noticed it through the high-arched windows of the eastern corridor. That particular gray that settled over Valethorn in late autumn, the kind that made the stone towers look like they were carved from the same sky rather than built beneath it. She had learned to read weather the way a soldier reads terrain. After a decade in this palace, she read everything. She had to. She was already dressed before the handmaidens arrived. Silver gown, high collar, hair braided back from her face in the severe style she had adopted 3 years ago when she realized that softness in this court was not elegance, it was exposure. She pinned the last clasp at her throat and dismissed the girls before they could see how her hands moved. Steady, deliberately steady. The way a woman moves when she has spent years training herself not to show what lies underneath. The summons had come at dawn, not from Darius. From the court chamberlain, in the flat formal language that meant the king had authorized the gathering but had not bothered to write it himself. A royal announcement. All members of the court required in attendance, Luna Serafina Vale included. She knew what it was before she walked through the doors. She had known for 3 weeks. The great hall of Valethorn Palace held 400 people comfortably. That morning it held closer to 600 because word had spread the way it always spread in places where power and gossip shared the same corridors. Lords and ladies packed the gallery tiers. Palace soldiers lined the walls in their red and gold, hands at rest, faces forward, performing the particular kind of stillness that soldiers used to pretend they were not listening. Servants lingered at the far edges with careful, downcast eyes. Serafina walked in through the eastern entrance and did not hesitate at the threshold the way a lesser woman might. She crossed the marble floor at her own pace, felt the shift in the room, that collective intake, that fractional turning of heads, and let it wash over her like a weather event. Something happening. Something she had no control over. Move through it. She took her position at the left side of the throne dais, not beside Darius. 3 steps below and to the left, which was the position she had occupied for 2 years now, ever since the unofficial reassignment that everyone pretended had not happened. Darius was already seated. He looked the way he always looked in public, broad-shouldered, jaw set, the alpha king who had held this realm together by force of will and the kind of presence that made rooms recalibrate when he entered. Serafina had once found that presence magnetic. She had stood beside it for years, leaning into its gravity without realizing that gravity was not warmth. It was mass, and mass did not care what it pulled apart on its way to what it wanted. He did not look at her when she took her position. She had not expected him to. Celeste Ravenwood arrived through the main entrance with the timing of someone who had rehearsed it. The court watched her the way courts watch beautiful, dangerous things, with hunger dressed up as admiration. She was tall, dark-haired, dressed in a gown that managed to be both modest and unmistakable. The fabric gathered at her abdomen in a way that answered every question before anyone asked. 4 months along by the look of it. Maybe 5. Serafina had been counting. Celeste moved through the crowd with the ease of a woman who had spent years learning which rooms she was not supposed to be in and had decided somewhere along the way that the prohibition was the point. Her eyes swept the hall in a single practiced arc, landed on Serafina, and softened into something that was not kindness. Luna Serafina, her voice carried. It was designed to carry. You came. I was summoned, Serafina said. Of course. Celeste's hand went to her abdomen, a brief, deliberate gesture, the kind that said everything it was meant to say without committing to saying it. I'm glad you're here. It feels right, somehow, that you should witness this. The hall had gone very quiet. Serafina said nothing. Darius cleared his throat and the room shifted toward him with the obedience of a field of grain in wind. He rose from the throne, all 6 feet and 4 inches of him, gold circlet catching the light, and his voice came out in the formal register he used for declarations. The voice she had once heard whisper her name in the dark. The voice she had spent 2 years cauterizing from her memory. "People of Velthorn," he said, "I have called you here to announce an event of significance to the crown and to the realm." The next minutes were a performance she had already written in her head. The formal announcement of Celeste's pregnancy. The careful, bloodless language about the continuation of the royal line. The acknowledgement that an heir, a legitimate heir, the language implied, though no one said it directly, would be forthcoming. She stood through it with her spine straight and her face empty and her hands clasped at her waist in the position that years of court training had drilled into her body. She had learned to wear stillness like armor. She was wearing it now. It was when Celeste spoke that the stillness became necessary in a different way. "My king." Celeste turned to Darius with a smile that was too wide, too warm, aimed at Seraphina's peripheral vision, like a blade angled to catch the light. "Before the court, I want to say, I understand this is difficult for some. There are those among us who have stood in this palace for years, hoping to give you what I am about to give. It must be a painful morning." The silence in the hall changed texture. Seraphina felt it, the collective holding of breath, the moment when a room realizes it is about to see something that will be discussed for years. She felt the eyes on her face. Dozens of them. Hundreds. "Celeste," Darius's voice had the faint warning tone of a man who had not expected this particular maneuver. Celeste did not stop. "I simply want to acknowledge," she said, her hand on her belly, her gaze finding Seraphina now with the directness of a woman who had decided the subtlety was no longer necessary, "that some women are chosen by the moon to carry royal blood forward, and some women," a pause, brief and surgical, "are not. There is no shame in it, Luna Seraphina. The moon knows its purpose for us all." The laughter that followed was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was the muffled, contained kind, the tittering that happened when powerful people found cruelty amusing but wanted the option to later claim they had not laughed at all. Seraphina turned and looked at Darius. He looked at the floor. For a long moment, 3 seconds, 4, she waited for him to speak. She watched his jaw tighten, and his hands grip the arms of the throne, and his eyes stay down. And she understood something she had spent 2 years almost understanding. The thing she had circled and refused to land on because landing on it meant the end of a world she had built herself inside. He was not going to say anything. He was going to let it stand. She turned back to the hall, found Celeste's eyes, and held them with an expression that Celeste, who had prepared for tears or fury or dignified crumbling, had not planned for. Something flat and ancient and entirely unbothered, the expression of a woman who had already been through a fire so much hotter than this room that the temperature here did not register as heat. "You're right," Seraphina said. Her voice was even, quiet enough that people had to lean in. "The moon does know its purpose." She inclined her head fractionally, with the precise formality of a court bow that meant nothing, and she walked out of the hall. She did not run. She counted her steps. By the time she reached the corridor, her hands had stopped being steady. Ditz. Her chambers were on the 3rd floor of the eastern wing, which had once been the Luna's quarters and had been quietly redefined over the past 2 years as simply rooms assigned to Seraphina Vale. The distinction was not official. Nothing in this palace was ever official until they wanted it to be used against you. She closed the door behind her and stood with her back against it in the dark for a moment, just breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her mother had taught her when she was 6 years old and frightened by a storm. Her mother had held her hands and said, "You cannot fight the thunder, little wolf. You can only breathe until it passes." Her mother had died when Seraphina was 14, and she had spent the next 20 years learning that some storms did not pass. Some storms were people. She moved to the window. Valethorn spread out below her, the layered rooftops and market roads and the river cutting through the lower city like a gray scar. She had looked at this view for a decade, and it still struck her with the same gut-punch awareness that this was a real place with real people in it, people who had no idea what happened in the rooms above them. The thing about humiliation was that it was designed to make you feel alone, singular. Like your particular failure was so unique and terrible that you were the first person in history to occupy this specific degradation. Celeste was very good at that design. She had a craftsman's precision for it. What Celeste did not know, what Darius did not know, what no one in that hall knew, was that Serafina had stopped being afraid of being alone approximately 47 months ago, in a pine log cabin 300 miles from this city, in a night of blood and cold and a midwife's urgent hands, when she had delivered 2 boys who came into the world already furious, already silver-eyed, already reaching. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window. Kael and Lucien, 2 years old at the time, now 5, living in the north with Marin, Serafina's aunt by blood, and by the kind of fierce, complicated love that sometimes runs in families like an underground current. Living quietly. Living safe. Living exactly as far from this palace as Serafina had been able to get them after the assassin's blade had opened her side in the 4th month of her pregnancy, and she had understood, with the cold clarity of blood loss, that someone inside Veilthorn's walls wanted her sons dead before they breathed their first air. She had never been able to prove it. She had not needed to prove it to know it was true. The knock at her door came 20 minutes later. She had expected it. She moved away from the window and sat in the high-backed chair near the fire, which she had lit herself because her hands needed something to do, and called out for them to enter. Mira Aldrin, her one remaining handmaiden, came in with the expression of someone who had witnessed a battlefield and was trying to figure out which parts to report first. Mira was 42, broad-shouldered, with the dark skin and close-cropped hair of the western provinces, and a face that did not waste itself on expressions it had not earned. She had served Serafina for 8 years. She was the closest thing to a witness that Serafina trusted in this building. "You need to eat something," Mira said, because she always led with the practical when she was most alarmed. "I'm not hungry." "I didn't ask if you were hungry." Mira set a tray on the side table with more force than necessary. "What are you going to do?" Serafina looked at the fire. "Nothing," she said. Mira's silence was its own kind of speech. "There's nothing to do," Serafina said. "He's made his choice. She's carrying his child. The court has their spectacle." She paused. "It's done. She humiliated you in front of 600 people." "Yes." "And he—" "Yes." The word cut it off, clean, final. Mira sat down on the footstool across from her with the familiarity of a woman who had stopped being a servant and become something else somewhere around year 3. She looked at Serafina with the kind of directness that Serafina had learned to read as the only kind of honesty left in this palace. "You're going to leave," Mira said. Not a question. Serafina did not answer immediately. "There's a package that arrived this morning," she said instead. "From the north." Mira stiffened. "A letter from Marin." Serafina reached into the fold of her gown and produced it. A single sheet of rough fibered paper folded into thirds, sealed with a smear of pine resin rather than wax because Marin had never owned a seal and had never found that worth addressing. "Kael has started shaping. His eyes go silver when he's angry." The fire cracked between them. "He's 5, Mira said carefully. "He's 5 and he's already shaping. Lucian hasn't started yet, but Marin thinks it's close." Serafina turned the letter over in her hands. "They're getting too big for the cabin. Too noticeable. A 5-year-old boy with silver eyes who can crack pine wood with his bare hands is not the kind of child you keep hidden in a northern village for very much longer. So you need to move them." "I need to move them." Serafina stood up. The decision had been made, she realized. Not in this moment. It had been made weeks ago, maybe months ago, the slow gathering of inevitability that sometimes passed for choice. "And when I move them, I cannot keep them hidden the way I've been hiding them. They're too old. Someone will see them. Someone will ask questions. And when they do—" She stopped. "When they do," Mira said quietly, "someone is going to recognize the bloodline. The silver eyes are a marker. The texts on it are in the palace archives. Anyone with access to the lineage records who sees those boys will know within 5 minutes what bloodline they carry." Serafina folded the letter back up. "Including the people who tried to kill them before they were born." The fire had died down to low coals. The room was getting cold. "Then what do you do?" Mira asked. Serafina looked at the window. At Veilthorn spread out in its autumn gray, its towers and smoke, and the ordinary weight of a city that did not know what was coming. "I stop hiding," she said. She spent the next 3 days appearing normal. This was its own kind of brutality, the performance of continuity in a place that had just publicly discarded you. She attended the morning court gatherings that were optional and therefore mandatory for anyone who understood the politics of absence. She ate in the smaller dining hall at the hours she was expected to eat. She spoke to the people who spoke to her, which was fewer than before, because courts are exquisitely sensitive to changes in the distribution of power, and the people who had been merely polite to her were now merely distant. She cataloged everything she did, noticed, heard. She had been doing this for 2 years. She had notebooks, hidden in the false floor of her clothes chest, full of dates and names and fragments of overheard conversation that she had never been sure she would use. Documentation of small cruelties and larger discrepancies. Supply shipments that did not match the ledger figures. Council decisions that appeared in the record with different language than she had heard spoken in the room. Correspondence between members of the inner circle that she had access to because she still held, technically, the title of Luna, which entitled her to certain administrative communications that no one had thought to revoke. On the second day, she went to the palace archive. The archive at Valethorn was housed in the northern tower, 5 floors of documented history, letters, bloodline records, military reports, treaty copies, and the kind of institutional memory that empires accumulate before they start to believe they are permanent. The head archivist, a man named Tolhen, who was 70 years old and had the memory of a man half his age and the interpersonal warmth of a stone wall, looked up when she entered with the expression of someone who had been expecting her for a while. Luna Serafina, he said, the title without the hesitation that had started appearing elsewhere. Tolhen. She did not smile. Neither did he. They had always gotten along better for skipping it. I need the lunar bloodline records. The pre-unification texts, if they're accessible. Tolhen studied her for a long moment, with the appraising look of a man who had watched a great deal of history happen in this room, and had developed opinions about which parts of it mattered. The original texts or the compiled summary? He asked. Original. He moved to the back shelving without further comment. This was why she trusted him. He was the kind of archivist who believed that the documents belonged to the bloodline they documented, not to whoever happened to be sitting on the throne when you asked to see them. He brought out a flat, age-darkened case and laid it on the reading table. I'll need 2 hours, she said. The archive closes at the 5th bell, he said, and went back to his desk. She spent 3 hours instead. What she found was not new information. She had read the relevant passages before, years ago, in the early and optimistic years of her time at Valethorn, when she had believed that knowing things was protection. What she was doing now was different. She was reading with the eyes of a woman who had 2 boys aged 5, silver-eyed, already shaping, whose lineage ran directly through the maternal line documented in these texts as the original bloodline of the Moon Realm, not the conquered bloodline, not the installed bloodline that Darius's dynasty represented, but the older one. The one that predated the unification by 3 generations, the one that the historians had spent 200 years writing carefully around without erasing entirely because some truths were too embedded in the stone of a place to dig out without bringing the walls down. She read the prophecy text 3 times. The twin sons of the silver line shall return in the kingdom's hour of fracture. What was hidden shall be the light that holds. What was discarded shall be what remains. She closed the case carefully. Tolhen did not look up when she walked past his desk. Tolhen, she said. Luna. If someone were to come looking for these records. She paused. Anyone. After today. The archive is open to scholars and court members with appropriate rank, he said, to the page in front of him. However, I am an old man with an imperfect memory. I sometimes cannot recall when a document was last viewed or by whom. Serafina looked at the back of his head. Thank you, she said. She left before he could respond. On the 3rd day, Darius came to her. She had not expected this. She had expected to leave before it happened, had planned to be gone by nightfall of the 2nd day, but the courier she was waiting for, a man named Graves who ran messages to the north through unofficial channels, had been delayed by weather in the mountain pass, and she was still in her chambers when the king's personal guard knocked on her door at mid-morning with the formal summons. She could have refused it. She went. His private study was a room she had been in hundreds of times. Books, maps, the large desk that had belonged to his father and his grandfather before that, the smell of old paper, and the particular kind of wood smoke that was unique to Valethorn's fireplaces. She had sat in the chair across that desk when they were young and newly bound, and the world felt like it had the right architecture. She had sat there later, during harder conversations, when she had still believed the conversations were worth having. She stood now. Did not sit unless invited, which he had not done. Darius stood at the window with his back to her. Even from behind, even now, there was something in his posture that she recognized the way you recognize the geography of a place you grew up and then left. Not as home anymore, but as the shape of something that used to be home. The way his shoulders carried weight differently on the left side. The angle his head went when he was building up to something he did not want to say. "Sarah," he said. She had asked him years ago not to call her that in formal settings. He had never fully stopped. "Your Majesty," she said. He turned around. His face was doing the thing she had watched it do for 2 years, the conflict running under the surface, the evidence of a man who knew he was doing something wrong and had decided to do it anyway, and was now surprised to find that the wrongness had texture and weight to it. "What happened in the hall?" he said. "Celeste went further than I had anticipated." "Is that an apology?" The question landed in the room with too much edge. She had not meant it to be rhetorical, but it came out that way, and she watched him flinch at it with the precise hurt of a man who had expected softness and received accuracy instead. "It's an explanation," he said. "She is—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. "The situation is complicated." "The situation," Serafina said, "is that your mistress called me Baron in front of 600 people and you watched it happen." "I didn't—" "You watched it happen," she said again quietly. "Darius, I am not asking you to have chosen differently. I understand what you chose and why you chose it, and I have spent 2 years watching you choose it in smaller ways every single day. I am not here to argue about the choosing." She paused. "I need to know if you authorized it." Something shifted in his face. "The public announcement," she said. "Celeste's comment specifically, whether that was planned or whether she surprised you." "She surprised me," he said. The words had the weight of truth on them. She had learned his tells over a decade, and the voice he used when he was telling the truth had a flatness to it, a lack of performance. "I did not know she was going to say what she said." "But you didn't stop her." A long silence. "No," he said. "I didn't." Serafina looked at him for a moment, at the king she had loved, the man she had believed in, the absence where the person she had built a life toward used to be. The fire in his study was the same kind of fire as the one in her room, the same pale winter light, the same cold creeping in at the window edges. It occurred to her that she was seeing this room for the last time, and she had known it when she walked through the door, and she had come anyway, had wanted one last clear look at it, at him, at the exact shape of the thing she was walking away from. "All right," she said. "Serafina," I said all right. She turned toward the door. "I'll be out of the palace by tomorrow." "That's not—" His voice cracked slightly, which was the first human sound he had made since she walked in. "I'm not asking you to leave." "I know you're not." She stopped at the door with her hand on the frame and did not turn around, because she did not want to see his face when she said the next part. "But you're not asking me to stay either. You haven't asked me to stay in a very long time, Darius, and I've spent a very long time waiting for you to." She left. She did not let herself feel it until she was 3 corridors away, in an alcove behind the eastern stairwell, where no one went at mid-morning, and then she pressed her back against the cold stone and breathed through it for 60 seconds. The grief, the anger, the enormous and complicated weight of a decade ending. She gave it 60 seconds because grief was real and deserved its 60 seconds, and then she straightened her spine and started walking toward her chambers to pack what she was going to take and burn what she was not. Graves arrived at the servants' entrance of the eastern wing at 3 in the morning. He was a rangy, weather-beaten man of indeterminate age, with the kind of face that had been outside in bad weather for so long it had accepted the elements as permanent and arranged itself accordingly. He smelled of pine and horse and the cold mountain air of the northern pass. He did not speak when she opened the door. He handed her a folded cloth pouch containing 2 items, a note in Marin's hand and a single object wrapped in rough cotton. The object was a wolf's tooth, small enough to be juvenile, worn smooth at the blunt end. Kael's milk tooth. He had lost it 3 weeks ago, apparently, and had asked Marin very specifically to send it to his mother. Serafina held it in her closed fist for a moment. Graves watched her with the flat patience of a man paid to wait. "I'm ready," she said. They had her out of the palace through the southern drainage passage, a route she had identified 18 months ago and never used, the kind of thing you locate and catalog against the day you need it and hope, quietly and without much conviction, that the day never comes. She took one bag, the notebooks, the documents, 3 letters, the clothes on her back and the riding gear folded in the bag's bottom. She did not look back at the palace, not because she did not want to, because she did, and looking would make the wanting worse, and there was nothing behind her now worth the cost of turning around. The north took 3 weeks to reach by the roads she and Graves traveled, secondary routes, sparse populated, the kind of territory that empires claimed on maps and governed in theory. She had money from her private accounts, enough for lodgings and horses, and the particular kind of invisibility that money purchased in provincial towns if you did not spend it showily. She wore plain riding clothes and kept her hair unbound, and she was, to any inn or road checkpoint they passed, a woman traveling north for family reasons, which was both true and the most uninteresting story available. She had 3 weeks to think. She thought about the archived texts and the prophecy language and the timeline of everything that had happened in Valethorn over the past 2 years, the slow decay of the infrastructure that she had watched from her eroded position in court, the supply discrepancies, the council appointments that had shifted the inner circle toward men she had never trusted, the border tensions that the official reports described as minor and that the unofficial reports she had no business reading described as something significantly larger. She thought about Celeste Ravenwood's ambitions, which had always been more systematic than they appeared. Not a woman in love with a king, but a woman who had identified a throne as an achievable target and had moved toward it with the kind of patience that only operated on a long timeline. She thought about Kael cracking pine wood with his hands at 5 years old. She thought about Lucien, who Marin's letters described as quiet, where Kael was loud, watchful, where Kael was immediate, the one who sat in doorways and observed rooms before entering them. 2 sides of the same inheritance, maybe. 2 ways of surviving the same blood. She thought about Darius's face when he said she surprised me. She thought about the midnight she had ridden south from the northern cabin with 2 arrows in the pack horse and a blade wound in her side that Marin had sewn shut with fishing wire, choosing direction by the stars because the road was not safe, and the way her whole body had understood in that moment that the palace she was riding toward was not the palace she had left, that the man she was riding toward was not the man she had loved, and that something fundamental about the architecture of her future had changed. She reached Marin's settlement in the 2nd week of autumn. The cabin was larger than she remembered. Marin had added 2 rooms since her last visit, a practical woman preparing for a practical reality. The property sat at the edge of a mixed pine and hardwood forest, backed against a low ridge, surrounded by the kind of silence that cities had trained Serafina to distrust, and that she had slowly, over the years of these visits, learned to understand as safety. She came around the last bend in the trail and heard them before she saw them, arguing, 2 voices in the high-pitched register of boys who had not yet decided whether an argument was worth a fight. She heard the crack of something wooden, a branch, a toy, something thin breaking under pressure, and then Marin's voice cutting across both of them with the particular patience of a woman who had been managing this for 5 years. Serafina stopped her horse at the fence line. Kael was standing in the yard with his hands on his hips, silver-eyed, jaw set, with the expression of a boy who was very certain he was right, and was furious that certainty was not automatically sufficient. 5 years old and already built like a boy who would be large, broad through the shoulders, solid in the way that wolf-line children often were even young. His eyes were silver, not pale gray, not blue with silver undertones. Silver, pure and unmistakable and ancient. Lucien was 3 feet away, sitting on a stump with his arms crossed, watching his brother with an expression of supreme, quiet judgment. His eyes were the same. His face was identical to Kael's in structure, but wore it differently. A different gravity, a different stillness. They saw her at the same moment. The silence that followed lasted approximately 1 second. Then Kael was running. He hit her before she was fully off the horse, caught around the waist, his arms locked with the grip of a child who did not calculate force against size and did not need to. She went down to one knee in the mud, and held on with both arms and pressed her face against the top of his head and stayed there for a moment that did not have a measured length, breathing the smell of pine and child and the specific warmth of a person you made, of blood, recognizing blood. "You smell different," Kael said into her shoulder. "I've been riding for 3 weeks." "No." He pulled back and looked at her with those silver eyes that saw more than they should. Different, like you left something behind." Lucien arrived at a walk. He stood in front of her and studied her face with his particular form of assessment, and then, with the deliberateness of a boy who did not spend affection carelessly, put his hand on her cheek. "You okay, Mom?" he said. She held his wrist, breathed out. "I will be," she said. Marin appeared in the cabin doorway with a look on her face that mixed relief with the particular wariness of a woman who knew that the appearance of Serafina at her door under these circumstances meant the quiet was ending. "Come inside," Marin said. "The stew's hot, and then you're going to tell me what happened." That night, after the boys were asleep in the back room, Kael flat on his back with his arms thrown wide, Lucien curled with his back to the wall even in sleep, facing the door. Serafina sat at Marin's table and told her. Not everything. She did not have words for everything yet. She told her the broad shape of it. The announcement, the hall, Celeste's performance, Darius's silence, the visit to the archive, the decision. Marin listened the way she always listened, with her hands flat on the table and her eyes level and her face doing nothing that it did not mean. When Serafina finished, Marin was quiet for a while. "You know what this means," she said finally, "bringing them out of hiding." "Yes. They'll be recognized. Within a month, once the silver eyes are seen by anyone who's read the lineage records. Probably faster, given what's in the prophecy text." Marin looked at her hands, then up. "Are they ready?" "Kael is already shaping. Lucien will be close behind." Serafina turned her cup in her hands. "They're not ready in the ways that matter for what's coming. But the alternative is keeping them in a cabin until the world comes looking for them on its terms instead of ours." "And the palace?" "The palace is collapsing in slow motion. I spent 2 years watching it. The corruption is structural now. It's not one bad actor. It's a system that Celeste has been systematically compromising for longer than Darius has understood." Serafina set the cup down. "When it falls apart, and it will fall apart, the question is whether there's something real left to stabilize it. Whether there's a bloodline that the old guard will recognize and the kingdom's foundations will hold under." "Your sons," Marin said. "My sons." The fire burned between them. Outside, the forest was still and dark, and the night pressed against the cabin walls with the weight of coming winter and the particular silence of a world balanced at the edge of its own upheaval. In the back room, Kael's hand had fallen off the edge of the sleeping platform and was hanging in the air, and a faint silver light, barely visible, barely there, the first involuntary shimmer of a power still learning it existed, was pulsing faintly around his fingertips in the dark. Neither of them saw it. Neither of them needed to. It was already happening. Pasik. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived that Serafina had not been expecting from a source she had not considered, a palace archivist whose name was not Tolan, written in a hand she did not recognize, with a seal she had to look at for 30 seconds before she placed it as belonging to the palace's inner circle division that handled bloodline authentication. The letter was short. It said, "They know the boys exist. They have known for 2 months, and they are not afraid of a prophecy. They are afraid of you." The letter was not signed. Below the unsigned message, in different ink added perhaps later, perhaps by a different hand entirely, were 3 words that sat in the silence of the cabin like a lit fuse. "Come home, Luna." Serafina read the letter 4 times. Not because she did not understand it the first time. She understood it on the first read with the cold, total clarity of a woman whose body had already processed the threat before her mind finished the sentence. She read it 4 times because she was looking for the angle, the specific shape of who had sent it, what they wanted from sending it, and whether the warning was a genuine act of risk or a trap designed to look like one. "Come home, Luna." 3 words. 2 possible meanings. Either someone inside Vialthorn still held enough loyalty to her that they had broken rank and put themselves at serious risk to warn her, or someone inside Vialthorn had identified her location, had known about the boys for 2 months, and had decided that drawing her back was more useful than sending men north to collect what they wanted. She set the letter on Marin's table and looked at it. Marin stood in the kitchen doorway, with her arms crossed, and the expression of a woman waiting for information she already partly had. "How bad?" Marin said. "They know," Serafina said. "The boys. Where we are." The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight and shape. The specific pressure of two women who had built something careful and hidden over 5 years, watching it come unmade in real time. "How long do we have?" Marin asked. "If they've known for 2 months and they haven't moved yet, it means they're not sure what to do about it." Serafina stood up. "Which means the boys' bloodline is complicating their calculus. They can't just disappear the twin heirs of the Moonline without creating exactly the kind of instability they're trying to prevent." She moved to the window. Outside, Kael was in the yard splitting firewood with the axe that was technically too large for a 5-year-old and that he had claimed 2 weeks ago with the absolute conviction of a child who had decided a thing was his. "Or they're waiting for me to come back, which means I'm the piece that changes the board." "Then you don't go back." Serafina turned away from the window. "Marin, I mean it. You stay north, the boys stay hidden. We move again. They've already found us once. Moving buys us time, maybe. Months. A year if we're careful." She crossed to the table and picked up the letter again. "And while we're moving, the palace continues to rot. Celeste continues consolidating. By the time the kingdom fractures openly, my sons will be old enough to fight for a throne that will be a ruin by then." Marin's jaw was tight. "You're talking about walking into a palace that wants you dead," she said. "I'm talking about walking into a palace where someone is afraid enough of me to send a warning." Serafina folded the letter. "Fear is a door." She gave it 3 days. Not because she was uncertain, because Kael and Lucien deserved 3 days of their mother present and not yet gone, and she took them with the deliberateness of a woman who understood that the future she was choosing would not look like this, would not have the cabin's low light and the smell of pine smoke and Lucien's particular habit of sitting close enough to touch without making contact, a boy who needed nearness but had decided that asking for it was a risk. On the second evening, Kael found her sharpening the short blade she kept in her boot. He sat down across from her on the flat stone they used as a step and watched with the focused attention he brought to anything that involved skill or tools or the specific adult seriousness he had been trying to decode since he was old enough to notice it existed. "Where are we going?" he said. She did not look up. "What makes you think we're going somewhere?" "You have that face," he said, "like you're deciding things, but the deciding's already done." She looked up at him then. His silver eyes were level and direct in the fading light, 5 years old and already asking the right questions, which was either the bloodline or Marin's influence, or simply the particular intelligence of a child who had grown up observant because his circumstances had taught him to be. "South," she said. "How far south?" She held his gaze. "All the way." He thought about that for a moment with the gravity of a boy processing something large. She watched him work through it, the flicker of something across his face that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but occupied the territory between them. "The palace?" he said. "Yes." "Is it dangerous?" She went back to the blade. Steady, even strokes, the sound of steel on stone in the quiet evening. "Yes," she said. Kael was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good." She stopped sharpening. He was looking at the tree line with the particular expression she had been watching develop in him over visits. Something that lived in the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, old in a way that 5 years should not have been old. Something inherited. "Lucien says the silver means something," Kael said. "Our eyes." He read it in Aunt Marin's old book. What did the book say? That the silver line was the first line, before everything else. He paused. He said it means we have to go back someday. Serafina set the blade across her knee and looked at her son. "Your brother is right," she said. Kael nodded once, with the finality of a boy who had been waiting for someone to confirm something he had already decided to believe. Then he got up and went inside to find Lucien, and Serafina sat on the stone in the cooling dark and breathed through the knot in her chest, that was not quite fear and not quite grief, but was the precise and particular weight of a decision made in full knowledge of what it cost. She left at dawn on the third day. Marin stood at the fence line in the cold morning with her hands around a cup and her face doing everything she would not say. Lucien had cried briefly and then stopped, pressing the back of his hand to his face with the specific self-consciousness of a boy who had decided tears were something to manage. Kael had not cried. He had gripped her hand until the last moment and then let go with the deliberateness of a boy practicing something. "Marin," Serafina said at the gate, "if I'm not back in 2 months—" "I know what to do," Marin said. "Move them north of the ridge. There are people there who knew my mother. They'll—" "Serafina," Marin's voice was flat. "I have kept those boys alive for 5 years. I know what to do." A beat. "I know you do," Serafina said. She rode south. She reached Vialthorn in 19 days, faster than the northern journey because she was alone and chose roads that were direct rather than careful. She came into the capital through the eastern market gate at mid-morning, ordinary clothed, on a horse that looked like 100 other horses, and she moved through the morning crowd of the lower city with the practiced invisibility of a woman who had spent 3 weeks learning to look like she belonged to whatever landscape she was passing through. The city had changed. She felt it before she could have articulated it. The specific difference between a city with tension in its normal rhythms and a city where the tension had become the rhythm. The market stalls were thinner than she remembered. The crowd moved with an undercurrent of wariness that showed in the peripheral vision, in the way people's eyes tracked the city guard patrols that passed with more frequency than she had seen before. 2 years ago, the lower city had been loud with ordinary commerce and argument and the specific noise of a population that felt reasonably secure in its own daily life. What she heard now was quieter and faster, the sound of people who had learned to finish their business and get off the street. She found the man she was looking for in the back room of a tanner's shop near the river market. His name was Aldous Crane, and he had been, for 12 years, one of the city's most effective information brokers, a service he conducted behind the thoroughly adequate cover of a mid-level leather merchant who had no remarkable characteristics and attracted no attention, which was exactly the point. She had used him 3 times before, always through graves, always maintaining enough distance that the connection could not be made. She was sitting across from him now without graves and without distance, and she watched his face process the development with the careful neutrality of a man who had survived a long career by keeping his reactions from showing until he knew where the risk was pointing. "Luna Serafina," he said, "this is unexpected." "I need everything you have on the inner circle since I left," she said. "Specifically anything touching Celeste Ravenwood, the council appointments from the last 6 months, and the border situation in the east." Aldous looked at her for a moment with the assessing quiet of a man recalibrating. "That's 3 separate threads," he said. "The inner circle material is sensitive right now. 2 of my sources inside the palace went quiet in the last month." "Went quiet how?" "Transferred. Or possibly more than transferred. I haven't confirmed." He paused. "Someone is cleaning house." "Celeste's people." "Almost certainly. There's been a reorganization of palace staff that officially looks like an efficiency restructuring and unofficially looks like removing anyone with loyalty to the previous administration." He met her eyes. "To you, specifically. Anyone who served under the Luna's household or reported to you through official channels." Serafina's hands were flat on the table. She kept them flat. "The border situation," she said. "The Eastern commanders sent a formal request for reinforcements 6 weeks ago. The request was processed by the council and assigned a review timeline of—" Aldous paused, the slight hesitation of a man choosing his words for effect. 90 days. 90 days for a reinforcement request from the eastern border. The Eastern commander sent a second request 12 days later, marked urgent. That request was recorded as received and has not received a response. The room had the smell of tanned leather and oil and the particular close darkness of a space built for conversations that did not need windows. "Who sits on the council now?" Serafina said. Aldous listed them. She listened. 3 of the names she recognized as men who had been in peripheral positions during her time at Vialthorn, not enemies, not allies, men who had always occupied the institutional middle ground that waited to see which direction power was pointing before committing to a direction themselves. Two names she did not recognize, and one name, near the end of the list, that made her go still for just a moment. Lord Caden Voss, who had been one of 4 men she had documented in her notebooks as having direct financial ties to supply shipments that had not matched the official ledger figures. Voss was now chair of the Interior Council. "When did Voss get that appointment?" she asked. 7 weeks ago. Aldous studied her face. "You knew him?" "I knew of him." She stood. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing yet." He held up a hand. "There's one more thing. Something I didn't put in any message because I didn't trust any channel with it." He waited until she had stopped moving. "Celeste lost the child." The room went very still. "When?" Serafina said. 3 weeks ago. It was managed quietly. Official story is early delivery complications. The child did not survive. The palace has not made a formal announcement." Aldous' voice was careful and flat. "But the court knows. And the kingdom is starting to hear." Serafina stood very still, everything she had read in the archive. Everything she understood about what Celeste had been building, the architecture of influence constructed around a pregnancy that was meant to secure a throne, a pregnancy that no longer existed. "She's losing ground," Serafina said. "She's losing ground fast," Aldous said, "which makes her more dangerous, not less. A woman with nothing left to lose who still holds the king's ear is a very specific kind of problem." Serafina picked up her riding gloves from the table. "One more question," she said. "The letter I received, the one that told me to come home. Do you know who sent it?" Aldous was quiet for a moment. "There's a faction," he said finally. "Small, palace guard, some older council members, 2 of the senior palace staff. People who've been watching the decline and believe that the situation requires a specific remedy." He met her eyes directly. "They've been waiting for you to come back." "They don't know me," Serafina said. "They know the bloodline your sons carry. They know what the prophecy says." He paused. "And they know that the king is not going to fix this himself." She left without answering. She was inside the palace by nightfall. Not through the front gate. Not announced, not summoned, not processed through any of the formal channels that would have registered her presence with the administrative systems that Celeste's people now monitored. She came in through the southern drainage passage she had mapped 2 years ago, with a contact she had arranged through Aldous, who walked her through the maintenance tunnel to the eastern stairwell and left without speaking. She moved through the palace the way she had moved through the mountain roads, efficiently, in the gaps between presences, reading the environment as she went. The eastern wing was quieter than she remembered. 2 guards where there used to be 4, which either meant staffing cuts or a redistribution of resources toward other areas that someone had decided mattered more. She noted it. She went to the archive first. Tolhin was still at his desk. It was after the 5th bell, and he was still there, which meant either he had stayed late specifically or he had known she was coming, and the fact that he did not look surprised when she appeared in the doorway suggested the latter. "You received my letter," he said. She stopped. "That was you." "The first one." He rose from his desk with the careful movements of a man whose bones had begun to lodge formal complaints about the cold. "The second note was added by someone else before I sealed it. I didn't know it was there until after I sent it." "Who else touched the letter?" "A guard named Oren. He has been with the palace 30 years and served under your household for 6 of them." Tolhin looked at her steadily. "He is one of the people who has been waiting." Serafina stood in the threshold of the archive with the dim lamplight throwing her shadow across the shelves of documented history at her back. "You took a significant risk," she said. "The records I showed you," Tolhin said simply. "The bloodline text. The prophecy." He paused. "I have been an archivist for 40 years. I understand what it means when the primary source and the living event begin to converge." He moved to the back shelving. "There are documents you did not see the last time. Things that were moved to restricted access after you left." He brought out a second case, newer than the first, and set it on the reading table. "These are the correspondence files from the Interior Logistics Division," he said. "Specifically, the ones that document supply redirection from the eastern border to..." He paused, and something in his voice went flat and precise. To private holdings belonging to Lord Caden Voss. The room had gone very quiet. Serafina crossed to the table and opened the case. The documents inside were dry, bureaucratic, and devastating. Ledger pages, transfer authorizations, supply manifests with 2 sets of figures, the official recorded quantities and the actual delivered quantities, the gap between them representing resources that had left the official system and entered an unofficial one. 3 years of it, systematic, patient, the kind of institutional theft that required someone in a position of authority to authorize each piece individually, which meant either Voss had that authority himself or he had someone higher granting it. She turned to the final page in the stack. The authorization signature on the most recent set of transfers, dated 4 months ago, was not Voss's signature. She recognized the hand. She had seen it on 1,000 official documents over 10 years. She had watched it sign her own commission as Luna of Valethorn on a morning when the world had still felt like it had the right architecture. Darius. She stood over the page for a long moment. The lamp burned. The archive held its particular heavy silence of accumulated paper and time. The king had not simply failed to protect her. He had not simply chosen badly or been manipulated into choices that damaged the kingdom. He had signed his name to the systematic draining of his eastern border's resources at a time when the eastern border was under active military pressure. Whether he had known what he was signing, whether he had understood what Voss was doing or had simply been managed into authorizing it by people who knew how to put the right documents in front of him, she could not determine from a signature alone. But the signature was there. She closed the case. "I need to keep these," she said. "They were already copied," Tolan said. "The originals go back to restricted access. You take the copies." He handed her a smaller, flat packet she had not noticed. "I have been a careful man for 40 years, he said. "I know how evidence works." She tucked the packet inside her riding coat. "Tolan," she said. "Luna. Be careful. Whoever is cleaning house, they'll get to the archive eventually." "Yes," he said. He did not look afraid. He looked the way very old, careful men sometimes looked when they had decided, with full knowledge of the options, that there was one thing left worth doing. "I know." She left him in his lamplight, surrounded by 40 years of documented history, adding one more entry to the record. She was in the corridor outside the archive when she heard the footsteps. Not the guard rotation, wrong rhythm, wrong weight distribution, the specific gait of someone moving quickly and trying not to. She pressed flat against the alcove in the wall and waited, hand on the blade at her hip, watching the corridor intersection 10 feet ahead. The figure that came around the corner was not a guard. It was a woman, middle-aged, in the dark dress of senior palace staff, moving with the barely controlled urgency of someone carrying information they were frightened to be carrying. She came around the corner and pulled up short at the sight of Serafina emerging from the alcove, and for a moment they looked at each other in the dim corridor light with the mutual assessment of 2 people determining whether the other was a threat. The woman's face shifted from fear to something more complicated. "Luna Serafina," she said. Her voice was barely above breath. "You know me," Serafina said. "I served in your household 4 years." She swallowed. "My name is Pell. I was reassigned to the domestic wing after you left. I've been—" She stopped, started again. "I need to tell you something. Something that changes everything you think you know about why they want you back here." Serafina looked at her. The corridor was empty in both directions. The 5th bell had long passed, and the palace's overnight quiet was settling into the stones. "Tell me," Serafina said. "Celeste didn't lose the child by accident," Pell said, "and the child wasn't Darius's." She looked over her shoulder once, a quick involuntary movement, and then back with eyes that were afraid and certain, and the exact expression of a woman who had decided the secret was more dangerous to keep than to tell. "The child was Voss's, and Celeste has known for 3 months that Darius has been building a case against her. She's not losing ground. She's preparing." Serafina went very still. "Preparing for what?" she said. Pell pressed a folded paper into her hand. Her fingers were cold. "She knows your sons exist," Pell said. "She has known longer than 2 months, and she has sent people north." The corridor was very quiet. Serafina looked down at the paper in her hand, then up at Pell's face, and felt the floor of every calculation she had made in the last 3 weeks drop out from under her. Kael and Lucien were alone in a cabin with Marin, and she was 3 weeks' ride away. Serafina was already moving before Pell finished speaking. Not running. Running in a palace corridor at the 6th bell with documents inside her coat was a specific kind of visible that she could not afford. She moved at the pace of someone with a destination and authority over it. Long strides, spine straight, the walk she had spent a decade training into her body until it looked like it cost nothing. Her mind was doing something else entirely. The calculation ran fast and ugly, 19 days south at a riding pace that had pushed the horse. Faster north if she pushed harder, changed mounts more frequently, cut through the mountain pass instead of around it. 14 days, maybe 12. Celeste's people had a head start she could not measure because she did not know when they had left. 2 months of knowing, Pell had said, which meant Celeste had been sitting on the information and choosing not to act on it. And the fact that she was acting on it now, tonight, while Serafina was inside these walls meant the timing was deliberate. It meant someone had told Celeste she was here. She stopped at the corridor intersection and pressed herself flat against the stone, breathing steady, running names. Aldous, Graves, Tolhin, Pell herself. The contact who had walked her through the maintenance tunnel. The faction of palace guards and staff who had been waiting for her return. People she had not met, had not vetted, had taken on Tolhin's assurance because she had needed to trust something, and the archive had been the most honest place she knew in this building. Too many people. She had moved too fast and trusted too broadly, and the woman who had survived 5 years in exile by being invisible had walked into Veilthorn's walls and made herself known to 6 parties in a single evening because she had believed that urgency was the same thing as momentum. It was not the same thing. She understood that now with the specific clarity of a person who has just seen the cost of a mistake before they have finished making it. She needed a horse. She needed the northern road. She needed to be gone in the next 20 minutes before whatever Celeste had put in motion inside this palace finished moving into position. She turned left toward the stable corridor. The 2 men waiting at the end of it were not guards in any uniform she recognized. They wore palace colors, the practical dark wool of maintenance staff, but they stood like men who had not spent their careers carrying firewood, weight forward, hands loose at their sides in the specific readiness of people who expected resistance. Serafina stopped. The taller one looked at her with the flat assessment of a man executing an assignment. "Luna Serafina," he said. "Lord Voss requests your presence." She looked at him, then at the second man, then back. "Lord Voss," she said, "can wait." "It wasn't offered as optional," the tall one said. She hit him first because he was closer, and because the second man was right-handed and she had watched his weight shift to the right, which meant his reach came from that side and she needed to be inside it before he committed. The tall one went down harder than she expected. She had not lost as much as she feared in 5 years of northern exile, which was the only good information available in the next 8 seconds, while the second man's hands found her coat and she drove her elbow back into his throat and felt the grip loosen. She was through the corridor and into the stable yard before either of them had gotten back to standing. The stable was half dark, one lamp at the far end, the warm animal smell of horses and hay, and the particular calm of large creatures who did not yet know something was wrong. She went to the nearest saddled horse, someone's mount left ready, tack on, water bucket still full, and was up and moving toward the yard gate before the stable boy at the far end had finished standing up from his stool. "Hey!" She was through the gate. The eastern yard of Veilthorn Palace connected to the service road that ran along the outer wall before meeting the main city road a quarter-mile south. She took it at a canter, not a gallop, because a galloping horse in the city at the 6th bell attracted a kind of attention that a cantering one did not. She moved through the lower city's night streets with her head down and her breathing controlled and the calculations running cold and continuous in the back of her skull. 12 days north if she pushed, possibly 11. Celeste's people had a head start she still could not measure. She rode hard until the city walls were behind her, and then harder still, into the dark road north, under a sky with no moon and stars cold and distant as everything else she had left behind. She made it in 10 days. It cost 2 horses and the kind of sleep deprivation that started after the fifth day, to do things to the edges of perception. The road ahead shimmering slightly in the morning light, sounds arriving a half-beat late, the persistent sensation that the shadows at the tree line were moving with intention. She ate in the saddle, stopped only when the horses demanded it, pushed through mountain weather that on the northern pass turned from rain to sleet and back to rain within the same afternoon. She did not let herself think about what she might find. Thinking about it served nothing. The mind that ran the worst scenarios was not a mind making useful calculations. It was a mind looking for somewhere to put its fear, and she had no time for fear to find a home. She came around the last bend in the trail on the 10th evening and saw the cabin lit from within, smoke coming from the chimney, the fence line intact. For a moment she could not make her body do anything at all. Then the door opened and Marin appeared in the rectangle of light with an expression that was not relief. It was the expression of a woman who had been managing something very carefully for 10 days and was now extremely angry that she'd had to. "Inside," Marin said. "Now." The cabin had the feel of a place that had been briefly and violently reorganized, and then put back together by someone who needed it to look normal for the sake of the children. Serafina saw it the moment she stepped through the door. The new lock on the interior bedroom door, the axe moved from the yard to the kitchen corner, the way Marin's rifle was leaning against the wall within arm's reach of where she stood rather than in its usual place above the mantel. Kael and Lucien were at the table. Kael had the expression of a boy who had been told to sit down and stay down and was operating at the outer limit of his compliance with that instruction. Lucien was watching the door. When he saw Serafina, something in his face unlocked. She went to them first, before anything else. She held them for a long moment with her arms around both and her face pressed against Kael's hair and felt the specific physical reality of them. Warm, solid, present, alive. And let that be the only thing that existed for those few seconds. Then she pulled back and looked at Marin. "Tell me," she said. 3 nights ago, Marin said, 2 men. They came up the North Trail, which meant they knew the property. The North Trail isn't visible from the road. You have to know it's there." She moved to the fire and stood with her back to it, arms crossed, the stance of a woman delivering a report. "I had the boys in the back room with the door locked. The men were—" She paused. "They weren't local. Palace gear under the traveling clothes. They asked about lodgers. I told them we had none. They looked at the property and left." "They left," Serafina said. "They left." Marin's jaw was tight. "And came back the next night, 2 more men with them." She met Serafina's eyes. That time they were not asking questions. Serafina looked at her. "Kael," Marin said, and something in her voice shifted. A fracture of a thing, quickly closed. Kael was in the back room, and he— She stopped again. "He came out," Kael said from the table. Not proud, not ashamed, matter of fact. "They were hurting Aunt Marin." Serafina looked at her son. "His eyes went full silver," Marin said quietly, and the back wall of the cabin cracked, the entire wall, from floor to ceiling. She paused. The men ran. The fire cracked between them. Serafina looked at the wall. She could see the repair now. New plaster, lighter than the surrounding stone, the repair so recent it hadn't dried fully. She looked at Kael, who was watching her with the expression of a boy waiting to find out if he had done something wrong. "You did right," she said. He let out a breath he had been holding for 3 days. "But we cannot stay here," Serafina said. "Not another week. They'll come back with more people, and they'll come in daylight and in numbers because now they know what they're dealing with." She turned to Marin. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." "Marin." "I said I'm fine." Marin's voice was flat and certain. "I need to know what happened in the capital." Serafina told her, not the version she had been telling herself on the road, the stripped, managed version that kept the fear in its box. She told her the real version. Voss, the supply records, Darius's signature, Celeste's child and who had fathered it, the faction waiting in the palace, the 2 men in the corridor. Marin listened without interrupting. When Serafina finished, the cabin was quiet except for the fire. "So Celeste is not just the king's mistress playing court politics," Marin said. "She never was." Serafina sat down. The exhaustion of 10 days hit her all at once, the specific crash of a body that had been running on urgency and had run out of it. She's been working with Voss for at least 3 years. The child was his. The pregnancy was leverage. Leverage on Darius, leverage on the court, leverage on anyone who might have questioned her position. When she lost it, she lost the tool. Serafina set her hands flat on the table. And when Darius started building a case against her, which I think he started doing around the time I appeared in the capital, maybe because someone told him I was there, maybe because the eastern border situation finally reached a level he couldn't ignore. She stopped waiting and started acting. She sent people for the boys, Marin said. She sent people for the boys, because the boys are the one thing that can stabilize the kingdom without her in it. If the twin heirs of the Moon bloodline are recognized and documented, her entire structure collapses. The court will have something to hold to. The old guard will have a reason to move against her. Serafina looked at Lucian, who had been listening to everything with his particular quality of absolute stillness. She doesn't need to destroy Darius. She just needs to make sure my sons never reach the palace. Lucian said, "But we're going to." It was not a question. Serafina looked at him for a long moment. Her younger son, quieter than his brother, watcher of rooms, the one who had his hand on her cheek within 30 seconds of seeing her. 5 years old and already understanding the shape of the thing they were all inside. "Yes," she said. "We're going to, Achant." They left the cabin 2 hours before dawn. Marin took the northern trail to the ridge settlement, which Serafina had planned as her contingency. The boys went with Serafina on the southern road, bundled against the cold, riding double on the horse she had come north on and the cabin's older mare. They did not talk much in the dark hours before sunrise. Kael dozed against her back with the absolute trust of a child who had decided she would handle whatever required handling. Lucien rode the mare with his spine straight and his eyes on the road ahead. They were a day south of the cabin, cutting through the lower pine country toward the main road, when they ran into the roadblock. 5 men, 3 on horse, 2 on foot. A rope strung between 2 pines across the road in the manner of an informal checkpoint, which in this part of the Northern Territory meant either local road bandits or someone official who had decided that official methods were too slow. Serafina pulled up and had 1/2 second to read the situation before the reading resolved into certainty. Palace gear again, under the traveling coats. The same as Marin had described. One of the mounted men moved his horse forward with the specific posture of a man who had been told to expect her. "Hold up," he said. She held. Kael had gone completely still against her back. Not the stillness of sleep. The stillness of a boy who had learned in a cabin 3 nights ago what the presence of certain people meant. 2 children traveling with a woman, the mounted man said, his eyes moving over them with the inventory expression of a man checking a manifest against cargo. "Heading south. You'd be Serafina Vale." "I'd be a woman traveling with her children," she said, "on a public road." "The children's eyes," he said. Just that. She looked at him. He looked back. There was no version of this moment that ended with the rope going down and 5 men going back to wherever they'd come from. She had known that before she finished the sentence. The thing about being recognized was that it closed certain doors very quickly. "Last chance," she said. "Walk away." The man on the right moved his horse sideways to block her angle off the road. The 2 on foot started forward. What happened next lasted approximately 90 seconds and left 3 men on the ground and 2 more at a distance that they had decided was preferable. And Serafina had a cut on her left forearm that was going to need attention and a broken stirrup that was going to make the next 10 miles uncomfortable, and both boys were physically unharmed in the specific way that she had put every available instinct into ensuring. When it was over, Kael slid off the horse and stood in the road looking at the men on the ground with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not a child's expression. Something older, something that had been watching from behind his eyes and had now stepped forward. "They were going to take us," he said. "Yes," Serafina said. "To her." "Yes." He looked at his hands. Something flickered around them. That silver light she had not yet seen directly, but had been hearing about for 3 weeks, faint and involuntary, the specific luminescence of a power that had not yet learned to stay contained. "Kael," she said. He looked up. "Get back on the horse," she said, not harshly. steady. The voice she had learned to use with him, the one that was not asking. He got back on. She took stock of what she had. One good horse, one aging mare, a cut on her left arm that was bleeding more than she wanted, two boys whose existence was apparently now known to at least two separate factions inside Valethorn's power structure. She had documents in her coat that documented systemic treason. She had Tolhin's copies. She had the knowledge of what Celeste was and what she had done, and the shape of the collapse that was coming for the kingdom, whether she was involved in it or not. She had 10 days of hard riding ahead of her to reach a palace where two men had tried to detain her, where Voss now sat on the Interior Council, where Darius had signed his name to things he either understood or had been maneuvered into without understanding, where a faction of old guard soldiers and staff were waiting for a bloodline they had not yet seen with their own eyes. She had two 5-year-old boys who had cracked a cabin wall and lit silver in a road fight, and who were, by every record in the archive she trusted, the rightful inheritors of the thing she was riding toward. The math was brutal, and she ran it clean. There was no longer any version of this where she arrived quietly. There was no longer any version where she negotiated from shadow, presented evidence carefully, let the political process work in the direction of truth. The roadblock meant Celeste knew where she was within hours of her leaving the cabin. The men had known her face, her direction, the road she would take. Someone had fed that information forward, and it had arrived ahead of her. She could not go back. The cabin was compromised. Marin was gone. The North was no longer a hiding place because they were no longer hidden. She could not go sideways. There was no third geography, no other bolt hole deep enough and far enough to mean anything with two silver-eyed boys who broke walls when they were frightened. Forward was the only direction that was actually a direction. Forward meant the palace gates. It meant showing up in daylight, in the open, in the full visibility she had spent 5 years treating as the thing most likely to get her sons killed. It meant making the approach before Celeste could organize a response to her current location. It meant arriving before the news of the road fight did, if she pushed the horses as hard as they would go. It meant walking into the throne room with two boys and every document she carried and the full weight of what the bloodline record said, and letting the kingdom look at what it was looking at, and trusting that the old guard who had sent her 3 words in a northern letter had meant them. Lucien brought his mare up alongside her. "Mom," he said. She looked at him. "Your arm is bleeding," he said. "I know." "Can I—" he started, then stopped. Then started again with the careful precision of a boy choosing words for accuracy rather than ease. "There's something I can do. I don't know how, but I know." She looked at him. At the specific quality of focus in his silver eyes, different from Kael's intensity, which was all forward motion and pressure. This was something more interior, something that operated below the surface of things. "Show me," she said. He put his small hand over the cut on her arm, and for a moment there was warmth where there should have been cold, and the bleeding slowed in a way that had nothing to do with pressure. Serafina looked at her younger son, at the thing he had just done with his hands in a cold road in the pine country, 5 years old, while his brother watched with unsurprised recognition, as though this was simply the next logical development in a long series of things they had already accepted. She thought about the palace, about the archive, about the prophecy language she had read in a lamplight room that said, "What was hidden shall be the light that holds." She straightened in the saddle. "Stay close to me," she said. "Both of you. Whatever happens when we get there, you stay close." "What's going to happen?" Kael asked. She looked at the southern road, long and cold and running straight toward what was coming. "Everything," she said. They rode through the night and into the next day without stopping. Serafina set the pace, and the horses matched it, and the boys did not complain, which told her more about what they understood than anything they could have said. Kyle rode with his jaw set and his eyes forward, tracking the road the way she had taught herself to track it. Reading the distances, the tree lines, the places where the terrain changed, and with it the nature of what could be waiting. Lucien rode quieter, internal, his hand occasionally finding her arm where the cut was healing faster than it should have. She thought about that, about what it meant that her 5-year-old son could slow bleeding with his hands, about the specific quality of light that moved through his fingers when he focused, about the way Kael's power expressed outward in force while Lucien's moved inward in repair. two sides of the same bloodline finding their form in two different directions. She had read the lineage text closely enough to understand that this was not accident. The old records described it exactly, the twin expression of the silver line, one to break, one to hold. She had not allowed herself to fully understand what that meant until she watched her son put his hand on her arm in a northern road and she felt the warmth. It meant they were not just her children, they were the thing the prophecy had described, not as metaphor, not as the kind of ancient language that courts like to read as flexible, but as precise and literal documentation of what these two boys were made to do. The weight of that settled into her spine like iron. She had been riding south to save them. She was still riding south to save them. But she understood now, with the cold completeness of a woman who had stopped managing her own clarity, that saving them and using what they were had become the same direction, and the only question was whether she arrived at the palace before Celeste's people had moved the pieces into a position that made arrival irrelevant. She pushed the horses harder. On. They came through Valethorn's northern gate at mid-morning on the 9th day. Not the eastern market gate, not the service entrance, not any of the invisible approaches she had used 2 weeks ago when she had still believed that invisibility was a viable strategy. She came through the main northern gate on the King's Road with two silver-eyed boys riding at her sides, and the documents from Tolhen's archive folded against her chest, and she did not look like a woman trying not to be seen. She looked like a woman who had decided that being seen was the weapon. The gate guards registered them at 50 yards. She watched it happen in real time, the moment of routine processing, the second look, the communication that passed between the two guards at the gate post without words, the way they both went very still. The silver eyes were visible at this distance in the morning light, unmistakable. The junior guard's hand went toward the signal horn at his belt and stopped when the senior guard caught his wrist. The senior guard was an older man. She did not recognize his face, but she recognized his posture. The specific bearing of a man who had served a long time in a position that required him to be certain, and who was now experiencing the particular paralysis of a certainty he had not prepared for. He let them through without a word. She did not look back to see if the horn sounded after they passed. It did not matter. Whatever was going to happen inside those walls was already in motion. The only variable was how fast she moved before it finished moving. But the lower city streets were wrong. She understood it within 3 blocks. The crowd's density and direction, the way commerce had stalled in pockets, people standing in groups and looking toward the Palace Hill with the specific posture of a population that had received information it did not know what to do with. Twice she passed clusters of people in urgent conversation that broke off when they registered her, registered the boys, and went silent with a quality of silence that was not neutral. She stopped a woman at a market corner, older, capable-looking, the leather apron of a provisioner. "What's happened?" Serafina said. The woman looked at her, looked at the boys, then back up at Serafina with an expression that went through 3 distinct phases in 2 seconds: recognition, assessment, decision. "Eastern armies at the city's outer wall," the woman said, "arrived last night. 20,000, maybe more." She paused. "And this morning, Lord Voss announced the king is unfit for rule and called an emergency succession session of the council." Serafina's hands tightened on the reins. "Where is the king?" she said. "Palace," the woman said, "as of this morning, but the council chamber is locked and Voss's men are at the outer palace gates." She looked at the boys one more time with that expression that Serafina was going to have to learn to read because she was going to see it a great deal in the next hours. The expression of someone recognizing something they thought was only in books. "The silver eyes," the woman said quietly. "Yes," Serafina said. The woman stepped back and lowered her head by exactly 1 degree, the gesture of someone who had made a decision. Serafina rode. Thuds. Voss's men were at the outer palace gates, 16 of them in council guard colors, positioned with the specific deployment of men who had planned this for longer than this morning. The inner gate behind them was closed. Beyond it, somewhere in the layers of courtyard and corridor and chambered stone, was the throne room and the council chamber and whatever was happening inside them. She pulled up 40 feet from the gate line and looked at the formation. 16 men with the outer gate locked behind them and the inner gate closed ahead. She had 2 horses, 2 boys, a knife, a short blade, documents, and the particular quality of absolute decision that settled into a person when they had eliminated every option except one. Kael spoke before she did. "There are more on the right," he said. "Behind the wall. I can feel them." She looked at him. "You can feel them?" she said. "Their weight," he said. "The ground." He frowned, uncertain of his own language. "Like when you know someone's behind you before you hear them." She had spent a decade in court learning to read rooms. Her son had apparently inherited a more direct method. "How many?" she said. "A lot." She looked back at the gate line. 16 she could see. More she could not. And behind the inner wall, somewhere, a council session underway that was stripping the king of authority with or without legitimate grounds to do so, timed precisely with an Eastern army at the outer city wall that was either Celeste and Voss's invitation or their leverage, and possibly both. The gate captain had recognized her. He was standing with his jaw tight and his hand on his sword hilt, and the specific look of a man who had been given orders to hold this position and was now confronting a situation his orders had not fully anticipated. "Luna Serafina," he said, "this gate is closed by order of the Interior Council." "The Interior Council," she said, "does not have authority over palace access under the Royal Charter's emergency provisions, which require—" She paused. "A two-thirds vote of the full council, including the king's appointed representatives, not a session convened by a single council chair." She held his eyes. "You know this." He did know it. She watched it register in his face. The flicker of a man who had been told he was doing something legitimate, and was now being offered evidence that he was not, and who was going to have to decide in the next several seconds which version of the situation he was going to commit to. "My orders," he started. "Your orders come from a man who has been redirecting Eastern border supply shipments to his personal holdings for 3 years, she said. She pulled the document packet from her coat and held it up, not offering it, displaying it. "I have the ledger records and the transfer authorizations with signatures, including his." The gate line had gone very still. "Step aside," she said. Quiet. Not a request. The captain's jaw worked. The hand on the sword hilt stayed but did not move toward draw. Around him, she watched the formation do what formations did when their certainty developed a fracture. Small movements, shifted weight, eyes that went from her to him and back. From inside the walls, distant but unmistakable, there was a sound. A deep, resonant crack. Not stone, not timber. Something else. The sound of pressure finding a release point. Kael's hands had started glowing. Not faint this time. Not the barely visible shimmer of a sleeping child's involuntary expression. Silver light, deliberate, pulsing slowly around both his hands with the specific quality of a power that had found its direction and was no longer uncertain about where it was pointing. The men in the gate line looked at him. She had expected fear. She had prepared for it, the way fear in armed men converted immediately into violence. What she saw instead was something older and harder to manage. The specific freeze of people in the presence of something they had been told existed only in the old records, confronting the gap between the page and the living fact of it. The captain stepped aside. He stepped aside and did not say anything, and the man next to him stepped aside too, and the movement went through the formation the way a current goes through water. Not dramatic, not loud, the simple physics of a thing finding the path that was already there. She rode through. The outer courtyard was chaos in the controlled form that preceded worse chaos. Palace staff moving in clusters with the direction of people executing contingency plans. 2 groups of armed men in different uniforms, palace guard colors and council guard colors, occupying opposite sides of the yard with the tense separation of parties that had not yet committed to the confrontation they were clearly moving toward. At the center of the yard, in the space between the 2 groups, stood Oren, 30 years of palace guard service on his frame like a second skeleton. The posture of a man who had built himself around institutional loyalty and was currently experiencing what happened when the institution developed contradictions. He was older than she had imagined from the letter, white-haired, broad through the chest, with the kind of face that had been resolving hard situations for so long that hardness had become its resting expression. He saw her. Something in his face released like a knot being cut. "Luna," he said. "Oren." She dismounted. The boys stayed on the horses as she had instructed. What's inside? Council chamber locked from inside. Voss, 9 of his people, and 3 of the king's appointed counselors who went in voluntarily. They've been in there 2 hours. He moved his eyes to the boys briefly and then back with the discipline of a man who had decided his reaction could come later. The king is in the throne room. Alone, last we knew. His personal guard was reassigned this morning on Voss's authority. Celeste? Eastern wing. A pause. She arrived 20 minutes ago with 6 of her own people. We don't know which direction she moves. Serafina looked at the inner gate to the throne room corridor, at the council chamber beyond it, at the eastern wing passage on the left. The Eastern Army, she said. What do you know? Commander Aldrich, 30-year man loyal to the old compact. He got no response to his reinforcement requests for 6 weeks. Oren's voice was flat and controlled. He is not here as an invader. He is here because he received information from sources I believe Tolhin arranged that the kingdom's central authority had been compromised and the border was being stripped deliberately. He met her eyes. He is waiting for a signal. He will not move without one. But if Voss completes the succession session and presents it to the city as a fait accompli, Aldrich's position becomes impossible, she said. A commander who rode on the capital to preserve a king who has already been legally removed. Yes. She looked at the 2 groups of men in the courtyard, at Oren's face, at the weight of what was sitting in this yard like a loaded mechanism waiting for a hand. How many of the palace guard are yours? 43 committed. Another 20 who will move if they see which direction the committed ones go. Voss's people. 60, 70 inside the walls, more at the gate. He paused. We are outgunned if this becomes a straight fight. It's not going to be a straight fight, she said. She turned to the boys. Kale was watching the courtyard with his silver eyes moving across the scene with the same reading she had been doing. The groups, the positions, the vectors of movement. 5 years old, doing tactical assessment, and the fact that it disturbed her less than it should have was itself information about how far they had all traveled from the world she had tried to give them. Stay close, she said. Both of you. Whatever happens. You said that before, Kyle said. I mean it more now. She went to Darius first. Not because she had forgiven him, not because she needed him, because the document she carried required a witness of standing, and because whatever Darius was, and whatever he had failed to be, the succession session in the locked council chamber was using his authority as its object. An authority that was being taken from someone was still theirs until the taking was complete. The throne room was cold. He was standing at the window when she came in, the same posture as the last time she had seen him, back to the door, looking at the city, and for one disorienting moment the 2 scenes overlapped in her perception. The man at the window then, and the man at the window now, 6 weeks and a world apart. He turned. His face went through something complicated that she did not have time to untangle. Then his eyes moved to the boys. She watched it happen. The recognition, not of their faces, which he had never seen, but of their eyes. Silver, exact, unmistakable to anyone who had spent any time with the lineage records or the portraits in the archive's older holdings. She watched the understanding move through him with the specific devastation of a thing a person has been told is true, becoming real in a way that telling never managed. His throat moved. They're mine, he said. It came out rough. They're mine, she said. They carry your bloodline. It's not the same thing. He looked at her, at the boys, at her again. The window light fell hard across his face and showed what 6 weeks had done to it. The specific aging of a man who had been dismantling the architecture of a bad decision, one structural piece at a time, and had gotten far enough in that process to see exactly how bad it was. Sarah, not now, she said. Voss is in the council chamber doing something that requires your signature to be legitimate and your presence to be challenged. I have documentation of supply diversion, 3 years of it, his signature and yours on the later authorizations. She set the packet on the throne room table. I need to know if you signed those knowing what they were. The silence was very short. No, he said. You're certain. Voss managed the Eastern logistics through my office for 2 years. I signed what he brought me. His jaw was rigid. I did not know what I was signing. She looked at him for a moment with the specific assessment of a woman who had known this man for a decade and had learned his tells well enough to read the difference between the truth that cost nothing and the truth that cost everything. This was the second kind. Then you have grounds to challenge the session, she said. Fraudulent authorization, the compact clause. You know the language. Serafina. His voice broke on it, just slightly. The fracture of a man who had been holding something at a distance and could not hold it anymore. I knew she had done something to you, after you left. I knew it wasn't... He stopped. I should have... Yes, she said simply. You should have. She picked the packet back up. We can do the rest of this later. Right now, the kingdom needs you to walk into that council chamber and use your voice for something real. He looked at Kael and Lucien one more time. Lucien met his gaze with the same steady assessment he applied to everything. Kael did not look away either. Darius straightened. Something settled into him. Not redemption, which was too large and too slow for this room, but the specific resolve of a man who has identified the one thing available to him and decided to do it without calculating the return. Let's go, he said. The council chamber door came open on Darius's voice, and the compact clause and Oren's 43 men arranged in the corridor outside it, and the first 3 minutes inside were the loudest she had been in since the morning in the great hall that had started all of this. Voss was at the head of the table. Serafina had built a picture of him from documents and second-hand accounts, and the architecture of damage a person leaves in institutional records, and the man in front of her matched the picture exactly. The kind of face that had never needed to be brutal because it had always had mechanisms to be brutal through. The kind of confidence that lived in systems rather than in itself. That confidence had a crack in it now. She put the documents on the table. She did not say much. She let the records speak in the language that mattered in a room full of council members. The language of specific figures, names, dates, the paper trail that fraud left not because fraudsters were careless, but because systems required documentation. And documentation did not care who it eventually faced. Voss looked at the documents, looked at her, looked at Darius standing to her left with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had stopped managing the situation from a distance. He looked at the boys. And for the first time in what she suspected was a very long time, Caden Voss did not have a mechanism available. This is fabricated, he said. Tolan made 4 copies, she said. 2 are already outside this palace. Tolan is an old man with an old man's loyalties. Tolan is an archivist, she said. He documents what is. That's all he's ever done. The room had gone very quiet with the particular quality of quiet that preceded the moment when people in positions started recalculating which positions were tenable. Voss looked at the door, at the council members around the table, at the guards who had come in with Oren's people and were now standing at the walls with the neutral attentiveness of men waiting to see which authority they would be obeying at the end of this. He looked at Kael and Lucien one more time, and something in his expression shifted into something that was not surrender. It was the calculation of a man reassigning his remaining pieces to a different board. Take them, he said. It was not directed at the men in the room. The doors at the far end of the chamber, the interior doors, the ones that led to the eastern passage, came open. Celeste walked in. She did not have 6 people with her. She had 12, and they were not palace staff or council guard. They were something else entirely. The kind of men hired for the kind of job that official personnel could not be asked to do. She looked exactly as Serafina remembered her, and she looked nothing like it, because the woman who had performed her cruelty in the great hall with the precise public elegance of a long-planned social execution was not in this room. What was in this room was what lived underneath that performance when the performance was no longer viable. Her eyes went to the boys and stayed there. I gave you a chance to stay gone, she said to Serafina. Her voice was entirely flat. You had a life, you had your boys. You could have kept both. You sent people to take them, Serafina said. I sent people to bring them here safely, Celeste said, because they were going to come to this palace one way or another, and I would rather have controlled the terms. The terms, Serafina said. The bloodline needs an adult to hold it, someone who understands how this court actually works. Celeste's eyes moved between Kael and Lucien with the specific assessment of a woman looking at assets. 2 boys without a mother are a great deal easier to guide than two boys with one. The word landed in the room like a blade hitting stone. Kael stepped forward. He stepped forward from behind Seraphina's left side with the total absence of hesitation, of a boy who had decided something and was done deciding it. And the silver light around his hands was not faint, and it was not involuntary. It was deliberate and bright, and it filled the corners of the room with the cold luminescence of a power that had spent 5 years becoming and had just finished the last piece of the process. Lucian moved to his brother's right side, quieter, his own light different in quality. Steadier, deeper, the silver that did not announce itself but simply was. Celeste looked at them. For the first time, Seraphina watched something move through Celeste's face that was not performance, not strategy, not the managed expression of a woman who had never let the room see what she was actually feeling. She watched genuine, unmanaged fear arrive in a face that had spent years never letting it show. The 12 men behind Celeste were looking at the boys, looking at each other, looking at the light that was moving through the council chamber's stone floor in slow silver pulses radiating outward from where Kael and Lucien stood. Seraphina looked at her sons. She looked at what they were, not what she had protected, not what she had hidden, not the secret she had carried for 5 years through blood and winter and every version of impossible. What they were. Standing in the room where the kingdom had decided they did not exist, full of the light that the oldest records said would return in the hour of fracture, side by side, 5 years old and already more present in this chamber than anything that had been built here in the last decade. She looked at Celeste's 12 men shifting at the edges of the room. She looked at Voss with his hands flat on the table. She looked at Darius standing to her left, his face carrying everything he had not said and might not ever say, but was holding with both hands now like something he had almost thrown away and was just now understanding the weight of. The Eastern Army was at the wall outside. The palace was balanced between two versions of what happened next, and Seraphina reached for the blade at her hip, and Kael brought his hands together, and the stone floor cracked in a line of light that ran from the twins to the chamber doors, and every person in that room made their choice, and the sound that followed was the sound of an empire deciding what it was made of. The crack in the floor ran 6 feet and stopped. Not because Kael's power failed, because Seraphina put her hand on his shoulder and he felt her touch and understood what it meant. Not yet, not this way, not with 12 men standing in a room where the boys were the closest bodies to whatever came next. He pulled the light back. It did not go easily. She felt the effort of it in the tension across his small shoulders, the specific physical resistance of a power that had found its direction and did not want to be recalled. But he did it. He drew it back into himself with the discipline of a boy who had learned, in a cabin in the north with an axe too large for his hands, that wanting to do a thing and choosing to do a thing were different muscles, and both required development. Lucien had not moved. He stood at his brother's right with his light steady and contained, watching Celeste's 12 men with the patience of a boy who had decided to let the room show him what it was going to do before he responded to it. The room showed him. 3 of the 12 moved first, the ones nearest the eastern door, the ones whose calculation had completed fastest in the specific direction of self-preservation over assignment. They went through the door they had come in, and the sound of their boots in the corridor diminished, and the 9 who remained looked at each other with the fractured attention of men whose formation had just lost its coherence. Oren's people were at the walls. The 9 men looked at the 43 palace guards and did the arithmetic that the 3 who had left had already done. They put their weapons down. Celeste watched them do it. She stood in the center of the chamber with her hands at her sides, and her face doing something that Seraphina had never seen it do in 10 years of watching. Nothing. Not performance, not management, not the layered presentation of a woman who had built her entire operational existence on the gap between what she showed and what she intended. Just the face underneath, which was tired and afraid, and more human than anything Celeste Ravenwood had ever allowed a room to see. Voss was already at the door. He was not running. He moved with the controlled urgency of a man who had decided that the council chamber was no longer a viable position and had identified a different one, which was either the palace's eastern exit or the specific kind of mistake that men made when they had spent so long operating through systems that they forgot what it looked like when the system stopped working. Oren said, Voss. One word. The voice of 30 years. Voss stopped. He turned and looked at Oren, and then at Serafina, and then at the documents on the table, and the calculation that had sustained him for 3 years finished running and arrived at its conclusion in his face with the blunt clarity of a man who has just watched the architecture of a long project come down. "It's over," Darius said from his position at Serafina's left. He said it without triumph, without the particular satisfaction that men sometimes allowed themselves at the conclusion of a confrontation they had won. He said it the way a person says something that is simply true and has been true for a while and has just finished being deniable. Voss sat back down. The next 4 hours were institutional. This was the part that no one told stories about. The grinding, necessary work of an empire reassembling its own accountability after a period of managed corruption. Statements taken, documents logged. The locked eastern doors opened and Aldrich's messenger admitted to the council chamber, a young officer who looked around the room with the wide-eyed assessment of a man trying to determine in real time which version of events he had arrived in the middle of. Serafina sat at the council table and answered every question put to her, and asked several of her own and watched the room do the slow, unglamorous work of deciding what had actually happened and who was responsible for which pieces of it. She watched Darius do the same, not as a king managing an outcome, but as a man accounting for what his name had been used for, the specific humility of someone sitting in the gap between who they were and who they had allowed processes to act through. Voss was taken to the palace holding cells. He did not speak again after the single statement he gave, which was short and covered only what was directly documentable and admitted to nothing beyond what the records already proved. The lawyers he would eventually hire would do the rest. Serafina noted this without judgment. It was simply what men like Voss did. The documents existed. The outcome was not dependent on his candor. Celeste was a different matter. She did not try to run. She sat in the chair she had been standing near and answered questions in the flat, precise voice of a woman who had made a calculation that cooperation offered marginally better outcomes than resistance, and who had enough operational intelligence to commit to that calculation cleanly once she had made it. She had framed the assassination attempt on Serafina during her pregnancy. She confirmed it without being asked, in the middle of an answer about the supply diversions, as though including it in the accounting was simply the efficient approach. She named the man she had paid. She described the mechanism. She delivered the information with the same register she had used for the logistics data: factual, sourced, attributable. Serafina listened to it without moving. The room was very quiet when Celeste finished that portion of the account. She had known. She had known for 5 years that someone inside the palace had sent the man who opened her side in the 4th month of her pregnancy, and she had run the list of candidates, and Celeste had always been on it, near the top, and the confirmation of the thing she had already known did not hit her the way she would have expected. What it hit her with was exhaustion. The specific bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had been carrying a vigilance so long it had become indistinguishable from her own nervous system, and who was now, for the first time in 5 years, in a room where she did not need to carry it. The exhaustion was not weakness. She understood that. It was the body's accounting for what it had cost to keep going through everything it had kept going through, and it deserved its acknowledgement the same way the 60 seconds of grief in the Eastern Corridor had deserved its acknowledgement, given its time, and then set aside, because there was still work. She turned to the young officer from Aldrich's army. "Tell Commander Aldrich that the Interior Council's emergency session has been invalidated on grounds of fraudulent authorization," she said. "The palace authority is intact. The eastern border reinforcements he requested are approved effective immediately." She paused. "Tell him I said the kingdom heard him. It just took longer than it should have." The young officer looked at her, then at the boys who were sitting against the far wall of the chamber on a bench that Oran had placed for them, Kael with his arms crossed and his silver eyes moving around the room in continuous assessment, Lucien with his head resting back against the stone and his eyes half closed in the deceptive stillness of a boy who was paying full attention and did not need to perform the fact. The officer inclined his head. He left. The boys fell asleep at the council table at the 7th bell. Kael went first, his head tipping sideways until it found Serafina's shoulder, the absolute physical trust of a child whose body had simply decided it was done regardless of what was happening around it. Lucien lasted another 20 minutes, his eyes closing slowly with the reluctance of a boy who did not like not being aware, before exhaustion overruled will, and he was simply asleep, his hand still on the table in front of him, fingers loose. She sat between them while the administrative work continued around her and did not move. She looked at their faces, at the identical architecture of them. The jaw, the brow, the slightly too serious mouths that both of them had, which came from her side of the bloodline and had been on her own face in childhood photographs she barely remembered. At the silver eyes closed now, the remarkable and ancient and apparently history-altering eyes that had cracked a cabin wall and lit a council chamber floor and stopped 12 hired men in their tracks. Currently just the closed eyes of 2 exhausted children who had ridden 9 days and fought a road ambush, and walked through a palace gate and stood in a chamber full of adults making terrible decisions about power. She thought about what Marin had said, the morning she had left the cabin the first time years ago, that Kael arrived in the world already angry and that Lucien arrived already watching, and that she had understood even then that she was looking at 2 different kinds of the same necessary thing. The world broke and the world repaired. Force and restoration. The capacity to fracture what needed fracturing and the capacity to hold what needed holding. She had not fully understood, when she was running for her life in a northern forest with an unborn pregnancy and a wound sewn shut with fishing wire, that she was carrying both. She understood it now, Darius found her in the east courtyard at mid-morning the next day. She was sitting on the flat stone bench near the old fountain, which had been turned off for the winter and sat dry and cold, its basin holding 2 inches of standing water gone gray with age. The boys were inside with Oren, who had taken on their supervision with the specific dedication of a man who had spent 30 years waiting to do something that mattered and had found it. She had heard Kael arguing with him about sword practice and Lucien asking questions about the palace's water system, and had decided that the courtyard required her presence more than the conversation did. Darius sat down on the other end of the bench. He was not wearing the crown. She noticed it with the peripheral attention of someone who had spent a decade reading the details of a person's presentation and still read them automatically. He was dressed plainly, the working clothes of a man who had not decided yet what kind of day he was having, and his face in the cold morning light looked like what it was. A man in his 40s who had been through something that had stripped several layers of insulation off whatever lived underneath. They sat for a while without speaking. "Voss will be tried," he said finally. "Formally. The council convenes a full session next week. What's left of it?" "I know," she said. "Celeste." He stopped, started again. "She'll be exiled. The council is split on stronger measures, but the exile motion has the votes." He paused. "She's already left the palace voluntarily. She was gone by dawn." Serafina looked at the dry fountain. "Good," she said. Another silence, longer. The kind that had things in it. Not empty, but full of the specific weight of everything 2 people have not said, and cannot say all at once, and perhaps cannot say at all, or at least not yet, and possibly not ever in the way they might have once. "I need to tell you something," Darius said. "You've been telling me things for 2 days," she said, "in the council chamber and before it and after it. This is different." His voice was not the formal register, not the administrative one, not any of the public voices she had catalogued over a decade. It was the voice he used when he had stopped managing and started talking. She had not heard it in a long time. "When you left," he said, "after the hall, I told myself you had chosen to leave, that it was your decision and I had respected it." He stopped. "I believed that. For about 3 weeks. And then I stopped believing it because it was not true, and I am not—" Another stop. "I am not someone who can maintain a convenient story indefinitely. I have tried. I'm not built for it." "I know," she said. "I let her do that to you," he said, "in front of the court, and then I let you walk out. And then I spent 2 years telling myself the kingdom needed what I was doing, and the boys—" His voice broke slightly on the word. "I didn't know about the boys, but the rest of it I have no—" "Darius," she said. He stopped. "I know," she said again. "Not absolution. Not the word that closed the wound and said it was healed. Something more honest. The acknowledgement of a person who had processed a thing and arrived on the other side of it without needing the person who caused it to explain it to her. I know what happened. I understand the shape of it, the reasons and the pressures and the specific series of failures that led to each piece of it." She looked at the fountain. Understanding it doesn't repair it. I need you to know that too. Yes, he said, and my sons, she paused on the word, deliberate. My sons will know their bloodline and their history and this kingdom and the people in it. They will know who you are to them in the biological sense. What you are to them beyond that is going to take a very long time and cannot be managed or rushed and will be entirely on their terms. I know, he said. Do you? He looked at her. The morning light hit his face and she saw what was in it, not the king processing an administrative situation, not the man calculating an outcome, just the face of someone sitting in the consequences of what they had chosen and not chosen, holding it without the mechanism of denial that had held it for them until the mechanism broke. Yes, he said. I know. She believed him. She did not forgive him because forgiveness was not a single morning's work, and she had enough self-knowledge to understand that, and she did not offer what she did not have. But she believed him, and believing him was something, and she held that something without inflating it into what it wasn't. The kingdom needs a structure, she said, moving back to the ground they could actually stand on. The council is depleted, the eastern border needs the reinforcements and someone to oversee the supply restoration. Voss's holdings need to be inventoried and the diverted resources traced and returned. She paused. And Kael and Lucien need to be presented formally to the court, not as a spectacle, as a fact. The bloodline records are in the archive, Tolan has the documentation, and the ceremony should be small and institutional and not... She thought of the Great Hall, 600 people, the sound of contained laughter, not theatrical. Whatever you think is right, he said. She looked at him. I'm serious, he said. I don't... He stopped, and the effort in his voice was the effort of a man dismantling something structural about how he had operated. I've been making the decisions that shaped this kingdom for a decade, and a significant portion of them were wrong. And not wrong in the way that honest mistakes are wrong, but wrong in the way that decisions are wrong when the person making them has stopped looking at the actual world and started managing their idea of it. He met her eyes. I would like to do things differently. I don't fully know what that looks like yet, but I'd like to try. The fountain basin held its 2 inches of gray water. The courtyard was cold and quiet and smelled of the particular damp stone smell of veilthorn in late autumn, which she had not smelled in 5 years and which her body recognized with the involuntary accuracy of a sense memory older than her decisions about this place. Then try, she said. Simple. Not gracious, not warm, not the word that forgave or promised or offered what she did not have. Just the acknowledgement that trying was available and that she was not going to prevent it. He nodded once and did not say anything else, which was the right choice. And after a moment he stood and went back inside, and she sat alone on the cold stone bench in the quiet of the old courtyard. The formal ceremony was held 12 days later. She had kept it small, as she had said. The throne room at half capacity, the council members who remained, the senior palace staff, the palace guard in their full complement, and Aldrich's delegation, 6 officers in the eastern border colors, who stood in the back of the room with the specific attentiveness of soldiers who had ridden on a city and found the city still standing and were still processing what that meant. Kael and Lucien wore silver, not ceremonial silver, not the elaborate court costumery she had rejected when the chamberlain offered it. Plain silver gray wool, well made, the kind of clothes that said quality without saying performance. They stood side by side at the front of the room and did not fidget, which she suspected cost Kael something considerable. Tolan read the bloodline record. He read it the way he did everything, without inflection, without theater, in the voice of a man who had spent 40 years understanding that the documents did not require embellishment because they were already true. The lineage, the silver eye marker, the maternal line of descent, the prophecy text, which in the cold daylight of a formal reading sounded less like mysticism and more like what it had always been, a pattern recognition, the accumulated wisdom of people who had seen this bloodline before and documented what it did. When he finished, the room was quiet. Oren moved first. He crossed to the front of the room and went to one knee in front of Kael and Lucien with the deliberateness of a man who had been waiting 30 years for a reason to do something and had found it. And the sound of his armor settling as he knelt was the only sound in the room. The palace guard followed, not because they had been ordered to, She watched the movement go through the room the way it had gone through the gate formation, the organic spread of a decision that was already made, that had simply been waiting for someone to make it visible. The guards, the staff, the council members who were left, Aldrich's 6 officers in the back. One by one, and then in clusters, the room went to one knee. Darius last. He did not do it as a king deferring to a political reality. She watched his face as he knelt, and it was the face of a man doing something that cost him nothing because he had already paid the cost somewhere earlier and privately, and what was left was simply the true thing, the accurate expression of a changed account. Kale looked at her. She looked back at him. She watched him process it. The room, the kneeling, the weight of what was being acknowledged and what it meant and what it would continue to mean past this morning, past this year, past the version of himself that was 5 years old and had cracked a cabin wall when he was frightened. She watched him look at Lucien, the check-in that passed between them in the language they had developed in the north, wordless and constant, the specific communication of 2 people who had been each other's closest world for all of their conscious lives. Lucien gave him the faintest nod. Kale straightened his spine. He stood before the kneeling room with the silver banner light falling across his face and his brother at his right side. And he looked at it all with the eyes of a boy who had been born to something and had spent 5 years becoming it, without knowing the name for what he was becoming. And Seraphina watched her son look at his kingdom and understand for the first time with his full self that it was his. Later, after the court had dispersed and the evening had settled into the palace's cold quiet, she found Lucien in the archive. He was sitting at Toland's reading table with one of the lineage volumes open in front of him, working through the old script with the focused patience of a boy who had decided that he needed to be able to read this himself and had not asked permission or announced his intention, simply located the book and started. Toland was at his desk. He did not look up when she came in. She sat down across from Lucien and watched him trace a line of the old script with his finger, lips moving slightly as he worked out the sounds. "You can read the old form?" she said. "Some of it," he said. "Aunt Marin had a primer. I practiced." He turned a page. "Mom." "Yes." He looked up from the book. His silver eyes in the lamplight had the particular quality she had spent 5 years looking at and still had not found the right word for. The quality of a person who saw things steadily, without the urgency of wanting them to be different than they were. "Did it go the way you thought it would?" he said. She considered the question honestly. She thought about the archive and the roadblock, and 10 days on a hard road, and a council chamber full of armed men and the sound of a floor cracking, and the long administrative work of an empire choosing to account for itself. She thought about the cold bench in the east courtyard and what she had and had not said to the man sitting on the other end of it. She thought about Marin, who had gotten a letter 2 days ago and sent back 4 words, "About time? Be careful," which was the closest Marin came to saying she was glad. "No," she said. "Not exactly." Lucien nodded as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. "Is it okay?" he said. She looked at her son, at the archive around them, 40 years of careful documentation, the accumulated record of a kingdom that had broken and been repaired and broken again, and was now, with whatever it had left, trying once more to account for itself. She looked at what she had, not what she had imagined, not the life she had tried to give her sons before the world changed the terms, but the actual thing in front of her, the boys she had kept alive, the walls she was sitting inside, the work that was not finished and would not be finished, but was hers, and was real. "It will be," she said. Lucien held her gaze for a moment with the ancient steadiness of those silver eyes, and then he nodded once, satisfied, and went back to the book. Toland turned a page at his desk. The archive held its particular heavy quiet. Outside, Vilethorn moved through its evening, the market roads thinning, the river carrying its gray light toward the lower city, the eastern wall lit with Aldrich's campfires, the silver banners that Orin had raised at dawn still moving in the cold wind above the palace towers, visible from the lower city, visible from the northern road, visible from a long way away. The woman who had been called Baron in front of 600 people sat in a room full of the oldest records of her son's bloodline and let the evening settle around her and did not need anyone to define what she had become. She already knew.